meet my bride. Let's go for a ride in my newfangled automobile. Just where we will go, nobody knows, but it's sure a great way to feel. Behind the wheel of the speed meter steel, it's my newfangled automobile. Hello and welcome to Vintage Car History. I'm Wild Bill. Scotland the Brave! Here in the U.S., a lot of Scottish heritage was brought across the pond and continued to grow. Americans have not only many Scotsmen that were instrumental in our own national history, but also to some extent feel a fondness for the land and its history. But over on the British Isles, Scottish heritage goes far beyond a movie by Mel Gibson and some family stories. It's fair to say that a bit of rivalry has existed between England and Scotland for a millennia or so. In fact, there is still on the books in England a law that states that it is legal for an Englishman on English soil to hunt a Scotsman with a bow and arrow, except on Sundays. Thus, when a Briton states that Lanchester, the motor car, was the first successful make of British car, said chap likely didn't confer with the northern side of the map, where a successful car, Scottish designed and built, was indeed the first car in the United Kingdom, the Arrol-Johnston of Glasgow. Scotland of the late 19th century was not the kind of place you would expect a car to be born in. Split between lowlands and highlands, the landscape was either very wet and cold, rolling hills and valleys, or rocky, rugged terrain, also very wet and cold. Roads in the highlands were, for the most part, glorified sheep and goat trails. In the lowlands, they were a muddy mess. Most of the roads in Scotland were not paved or particularly well maintained. So if a car was going to be able to use these kinds of roads, it had better be able to take a lot of punishment and keep on trucking. This is exactly what George Johnston had in mind. Born in Glasgow in 1855, he was yet another young engineering-minded kid of the 19th century that, in his case, decided to pursue that career instead of being a church pastor as his father before him. So, with his father's blessing, he apprenticeshiped at a local locomotive company, specifically the Hyde Park Locomotive Company in Springburn. He excelled, and within 10 years at the company was both a qualified train engineer and designer. The city of Glasgow had a public transportation system at this time. Horse-drawn rail trams connected the city. But someone in the city government had the idea of maybe making these trams steam-powered. They approached Hyde Park to come up with a design, and the job came to George's desk. George was told to come up with a design and build it within 6 months, a tall order. But he did pull it off, and in 1894, the first test run of his steam tram was underway. However, he did not have much time to either design or build the thing, and so he had to cut some corners, including making the basic frame of the thing out of wood. This is not a bad thing per se, but the heat of the engine and boiler meant that the tram caught fire and burned up on the road. This is considered a design flaw and a bad thing, even in Scotland. The good thing was that even though it did catch fire rather badly, the concept itself was solid, and George did make a vehicle that initially worked. He decided to change his focus from trams and design an actual car. Cars were, at the time, becoming quite the sensation in Germany and France, and George took notice, studying the vehicles that were coming to the market, and like many engineers, decided that he could do way better. First, he put aside steam and went with a gas engine. But he didn't like the engines of Europe and therefore designed his own. And there was nothing like it. An opposed twin-cylinder engine with 4 pistons. Yes, this engine had no cylinder head. Imagine 2 pistons in each cylinder meeting at the middle and then being pushed outward by the explosion between them. The pistons were not directly connected to the crankshaft. Several levers and fulcrums brought the power to the crank and eventually to the tranny and wheels. The torque that this engine put out was phenomenal for a gas engine of the time, the kind of torque that could handle lowland bogs and highland rocks with the right car wrapped around it. Thus, in 1895, he built his car, the first ever in the British Isles. Calling it the Mo car, he drove onto the roads of Glasgow and immediately ran into trouble with the law. England was still under various laws that were anti-automobile, and he got stuck with a fine. But there were those in Parliament that were softening up to the car, one of them being Sir William Arrol. He was both an engineer and politician and wanted a piece of the action. He and Arrol-Johnston got together and, in late 1895, founded the Mo Car Syndicate to bring this car into full production. Within a year of establishing the company, the red flag law in England was rescinded and production began in earnest. The first model, the dog cart, was an immediate success. The car was robustly built, a heavy wooden frame, stout body, and George's twin-cylinder 4-piston engine producing an extraordinary 9 horsepower with tons of torque behind it. No Scottish road was safe from this car. It could seat 6 people and take a beating in the process. True, this car had its quirks, among them being that it did not have either an electric or crank starter. You got it running like a lawnmower. You pulled a rope on the crank that went through the floorboards. But it was very popular and remained in production for 10 years. Of course, Arrol-Johnston cars remained a popular brand for decades, making quality cars through to the late 1920s. But make no mistake, this stubby, peculiar, and unusually powerful car was the first production car ever in the British Empire. Thanks for watching Vintage Car History, and we'll see you next week. Peace.